Kentucky, 1871, the year the ground learned to breathe. Rain clattered on the tobacco sheds and the clay ran red under lantern light, and a physician in a travel coat knelt at the lip of a farmhouse well, holding a glass vial that steamed in the night as if it had a pulse. The Merrick woman watched him with a steady smile that did not reach her eyes. Behind her, a table bent with loaves and jars and milk that gleamed as if lit from within. In the valley beyond, other houses were thin with hunger and hymns, yet here a cradle creaked under the weight of a child who never cried. The war had ended and left its rust in every mouth, but this place had learned a new taste. The field spoke in the way that wounded things speak, not with words, but with the insistence of breath that should not be there at all. Fences leaned like tired ribs. Barn doors coughed their hinges. The wind dragged a scent of wet iron from the ground and pressed it against the tongue, until the tongue forgot what bread should be. And still, the Merrick rose stood lush as midsummer, too alive for the month, tassels heavy, stalks slick to the touch. It was a wrong kind of mercy, and the valley learned to eat and look away. While smokehouses elsewhere went to cobweb and quiet, the Merrick kitchen never cooled. Men who cursed them at night accepted their soup at noon. Women who crossed themselves when the well began to hum packed their children's mouths with Merrick cornbread. To keep a child alive is a clean sin, they said, and they swallowed both gratitude and fear. But on still nights the wind did not move, and yet the corn shook as if something beneath it turned over in sleep. Dogs would not pass the garden gate. The well stone stayed warm after midnight. A sweetness rimmed the air that did not come from blossoms, a sweetness that hovered at the edge of rot. The oldest in the valley muttered that the land remembers what it drinks, that a field will keep an appetite once it has learned one, and they cautioned not to dig on the dark of the moon, not to look the water in the face, not to let a blessing be said with the door open lest the ground hear its own name. The physician listened as a man of measures, tapping his vial, counting his breaths, and yet as the hum rose he found himself answering with his own throat, a quiet sound, a note the well seemed to understand. So he pulled a rope and lowered the glass, and the water rose to meet him like a living thing that knew the shape of his hand. If you are still here, if the hum has reached you through the speaker and the night where you sit, press your mark on this record, like the neighbors who took bread with their eyes turned down. Like the video, subscribe to the archive, and come with me now as we climb from this well mouth and begin at the first buried name. The year was still raw with the wounds of war, and Kentucky bore its scars like a field that had been plowed too deep. The hills rolled with tobacco and corn, but in many valleys the harvests failed, leaving gaunt faces to watch the sky for mercy. It was in this time of scarcity that Dr. Elias Harper, a physician dispatched from Louisville, rode into the county with a ledger tucked beneath his arm and an oath still burning in his chest. He had seen cholera strip whole villages in days, typhoid simmer like fever in the wells, and the hunger that follows every battlefield. His task was simple on paper: to record mortality, to measure disease, to bring the dry comfort of numbers to men who feared curses more than contagion. Yet almost at once whispers reached him, carried in the hush of church vestibules and the hesitant breath of mothers. The Merrick family, they said, had lost no one. Their children were plump, their crops obscene in abundance, their livestock fat with milk while neighbors scraped bones for broth. And yet the tone of those whispers was not admiration, but dread. Harper dismissed it at first as envy, that ancient rot in every parish. But envy did not explain the figures he wrote down in his ledger. Entire households gone hollow, dates of death packed close like teeth in a jaw, but always a blank where the Merricks should have stood. When he asked for the cause of such resilience, voices thinned. Some claimed the Merricks prayed in a manner older than Scripture. Others said they had dug a well too deep, one that struck not water but something older beneath the stone. The preacher himself, when pressed, could not hide the tremor in his voice as he muttered, "They are blessed, but not by God." Harper felt his reason bristle, yet it was the silence that troubled him most. Neighbors would not name them after sundown. Doors closed when he asked too many questions. Children looked away when he walked by. It was as if the entire county had conspired to live alongside a secret they dared not confront, and yet could not stop feeding from. The doctor resolved to see the farm with his own eyes. His first glimpse of the Merrick land came under a dim harvest moon. The corn still stood green when it should have been dry, tassels thick and heavy with life. The soil was damp, though no rain had fallen for weeks, and as his horse shifted uneasily on the road, Harper swore he saw the faintest shimmer, as if the stalks sweated under the night sky. He dismounted and pressed his hand to the earth. It was warm. Not the warmth of sun, but something that pulsed faintly, like flesh under a fever. The farmstead itself glowed faintly through the trees, lantern light spilling from windows, laughter carried on the breeze, the scent of fresh bread thick in the air. In a county that mourned and starved, here was laughter and fat and warmth. He entered as a guest, greeted with smiles too polished, too rehearsed. The matron, Eleanor Merrick, pressed bread and milk upon him, food rich and sweet, though it left a metallic aftertaste he could not place. The children's eyes gleamed with a vitality he had not seen in months, yet their gaze lingered too long, too steady. Harper recorded his observations in the ledger that night, his ink blotting with a trembling hand. He wrote of health and vigor, of impossible crops, of children without pallor. Yet in the corner of the kitchen, where the fire burned low, he felt a faint vibration beneath the floorboards. It was rhythmic, steady, a beat that did not belong to the wind or the hearth. The Merricks did not seem to hear it. They only smiled, their voices carrying over the throb like hymns above a grave. That night, when Harper returned to the boarding room given to him, he could not sleep. He lay awake with the taste of the milk still on his tongue, the faint hum of the earth echoing in his ears. He tried to reason it away, to find an explanation in geology, in fever, in anything measurable. But reason fled when he dreamed, for in sleep the sound of the hum grew louder, and he saw fields that breathed, stalks that swayed though no wind touched them, and a well whose dark mouth glistened as though wet with hunger. And when he woke, his hand still trembled as if something had touched it in the dream and had not let go. It was then, in the quiet hour before dawn, that Harper resolved to seek the source. If the ground itself carried the secret of the Merrick's survival, then he would find it. He would measure it, explain it, name it. Yet as he looked once more upon the silent fields from his window, he realized he had already crossed a threshold, and that the hum had begun to follow him. And so he turned his eyes toward the old well that stood at the center of the farmyard, the one villagers warned him never to approach after midnight. The well stood at the heart of the Merrick farm, like a sentinel that no one dared name. Its stones were older than the house itself, rough-hewn and dark with moss, yet they gleamed faintly as if something beneath polished them from within. Dr. Elias Harper first saw it under a waning moon, when the wind had fallen silent and the air carried that same sweet metallic odor he could not banish from his mouth. The family passed by it often, carrying buckets with practiced hands, but he noticed they never lowered the rope when strangers were present. That secrecy pricked him deeper than any rumor, for it was not the silence of modesty but of fear disguised as routine. One evening, under the pretense of sleeplessness, Harper stepped from his lodging and crossed the yard. The air was thick with the hum that had haunted his dreams, a vibration that seemed to swell from the very earth. Standing at the rim of the well, he peered down into the blackness where water should have gleamed, but instead absorbed his lantern's light as if the shaft swallowed fire. He felt the urge to call out, to test the echo, but his throat tightened with the certainty that an answer would come. Instead, he tied a small glass vial to the rope, lowered it slowly, and listened. The rope quivered in his hand, not with the weight of water, but with a faint resistance, as if something below tugged back with a will of its own. When he drew the vial up, it was warm to the touch. He held it under the lantern. The liquid shimmered with a faint opalescence, neither clear nor cloudy, carrying the scent of rain on iron. It pulsed faintly, as if it breathed. Harper tried to dismiss it as a trick of exhaustion, but when he pressed the cork tight, the glass seemed to thrum in his palm with the same rhythm as the floorboards beneath the Merrick kitchen. For the first time, he felt the ledger in his satchel had become not a tool of science, but a shield against what had no name. The following morning, he attempted to speak of it to Eleanor Merrick. She smiled gently, too gently, and told him the well had quenched their family's thirst for generations, long before the war and its hungers. "It gives us what we need," she said, her eyes steady, "as long as we give it what it remembers." Harper pressed her for clarity, but she only smoothed the tablecloth with hands that did not tremble. The conversation ended when a child entered, carrying a pitcher brimming with the same luminous water, its surface rippling though the child held it perfectly still. That day, Harper carried the vial to the parish in hopes of showing it to Reverend Cole, the only man in the county whose courage seemed unsoftened by Merrick hospitality. The preacher examined the glass with pale lips pressed tight, then guided Harper into the rectory, where the church kept its oldest records. There, among marriage lines and baptismal notes, he revealed a family Bible so swollen with annotations it seemed less a holy book than a chronicle. Births were written in careful script, but many names had been scratched out, replaced by others, as though the same child had been born twice. In the margin of one entry was a sealed envelope, its paper browned and brittle, addressed in the hand of a midwife who had disappeared decades earlier. The seal crumbled in Harper's hands, and inside he read words that chilled the marrow more than any fever. The child was not born alone. Something else was present. The air thickened, the floor shifted, and when I cut the cord, I felt the earth itself recoil. I cannot return. The note ended there, but a faint smear, darker than ink, streaked the fold. Harper stared at it too long, unable to tell if it was blood or soil or both. Reverend Cole closed the Bible with a heavy thud and whispered, "There are records the church would not keep, Doctor. Some memories are safer buried, and yet, as they sat in that dim room with the shutters drawn, Harper could swear he still heard the hum of the Merrick well, steady, patient, as though the earth itself was pressing its rhythm against the walls, waiting for him to write it down." The rectory smelled of mildew and candle smoke, its wooden beams groaning with every gust of wind outside. Reverend Cole sat opposite Dr. Harper, the Bible lying open like a wound between them. The doctor traced the faded ink with his trembling finger, rereading the midwife's vanished testimony. The words were unsteady, broken as if she had written in haste, but they carried the weight of something not meant for the living. Harper wanted to ask the Reverend why he had hidden this record, why the parish ledger listed deaths and baptisms, but omitted entire branches of the Merrick line. Cole, however, stared at the floor with his hands clasped, lips moving in a prayer too low to hear. When Harper pressed, the preacher raised his eyes, rimmed red, and whispered that the Merricks had buried more than their dead. The doctor demanded clarity. Cole resisted, then relented with a voice that cracked like rotting timber. He spoke of funerals with empty coffins, of graves that sank faster than earth could take them, of midnight vigils where the ground trembled and parishioners fled before dawn. He told Harper that the Merricks kept a vault in the cemetery, sealed with iron, but no record showed who lay within. He admitted that each time he tried to approach, his lantern sputtered, and his breath caught, as if something invisible wrapped around his throat. "They are not preserved by prayer," Cole muttered. "Their lineage is watered with something older, something that listens." Harper, his rational mind fraying, sought to return to the safety of evidence. He produced the vial from the well, placing it on the table between them. In the flicker of candlelight, the liquid shifted, tiny ripples forming though the glass stood still. Cole recoiled, whispering a fragment of Latin. Harper, desperate, leaned closer, insisting it must be mineral contamination, some natural effusion seeping from the stone. Yet even as he spoke, he could not ignore the faint pulse that matched his own heartbeat, a rhythm that seemed to align with the very thrum beneath the rectory floor. The Reverend's hand shot forward, slamming the Bible shut, extinguishing the candle in the same motion. Darkness fell heavy, broken only by the faint glow from the vial. They sat in silence, listening, from somewhere distant, perhaps the valley, perhaps within their own chests. A hum gathered, low and steady like a choir beneath the soil. Harper clutched the glass, but the sound did not fade. Instead, it swelled until the very shutters rattled. Cole leaned forward, his breath hot against Harper's ear, and said, "Doctor, you must not sleep under that roof again. The well has heard you." But Harper could not obey, for even in that suffocating dark, he felt the pull of knowledge stronger than the tug of dread. He knew that if the church records held fragments of truth, the Merrick's own house must hold more, something deeper, hidden not in scripture but in flesh and earth. And so, against the Reverend's pleas, Harper returned to the farm. That night, Restless and unable to rid himself of the hum inside his skull, he followed the faint scent of smoke and iron that led him past the barns to the old smokehouse. The door hung crooked, the hinges squealing as if in protest. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of salted meat, but beneath it lingered another odor, sweet and metallic, the same that haunted his tongue since the first meal at the Merrick table. As his eyes adjusted, he saw what the Merricks had hidden. Behind racks of pork and venison, the floor gave way to a narrow stair carved into earth. Lantern in hand, Harper descended, each step carrying him deeper into a chamber that had never been meant for light. There, beneath the smokehouse, he discovered the room that would haunt him more than any graveyard ledger, the room of rendered light. The lantern flame quivered as Harper descended into the hollow beneath the Merrick smokehouse. The stair was narrow, damp, carved not by tools but as though the earth itself had yielded willingly, smoothed by hands that pressed from within. The air grew warmer with each step, carrying that cloying sweetness of iron and spoiled honey, the same taste that lingered in every loaf and jar the family pressed upon their guests. At the bottom, the chamber opened wide enough for Harper to lift the lantern high, and what the light revealed drew the breath from his lungs. Shelves lined the earthen walls, laden with glass jars sealed with wax. Inside them floated organs, hearts, livers, kidneys, though their colors were wrong, too luminous, shimmering faintly as though lit from beneath the skin. Each time the lantern flame flickered, the contents seemed to stir, a ripple chasing along the tissue as if answering the rhythm of the doctor's own pulse. On a central table lay bundles wrapped in cloth and string, their outlines unmistakably human in shape, though too small, too shriveled, like infants denied the chance to cry. Harper's hand shook as he reached forward and pressed a finger against the cool glass of one jar. At once the contents stirred, rippling toward him as if recognizing touch, as if eager. He pulled back, his stomach churning, the metallic taste now rising sharp as blood in his throat. He staggered to the far wall, where he found not jars but ledgers, Merrick records written in cramped hands, not prayers but recipes. Instructions for mixing well water with blood, for feeding soil with sacrifice, for binding the harvest to flesh. The words blurred as Harper read them, for the chamber itself seemed to vibrate, the hum now stronger than ever. He realized then that the sound did not come from above, nor from the jars, but from the earth itself, a steady throb that passed through stone, through wood, through marrow. Suddenly, above his head he heard a board creak. The Merricks were moving in the house above. He doused the lantern, holding his breath in darkness so complete it felt liquid, pressing around him like the inside of a mouth. In that silence, another sound rose, a wet sigh, slow and patient, from somewhere deeper in the soil behind the wall. It was not the sound of wind nor water, but of something vast shifting in sleep. Harper fled the chamber, climbing the earthen stair with desperate steps, heart hammering in rhythm with the hum he could not escape. When he emerged into the cool night, the stars overhead seemed dimmer, smothered. The farm lay quiet, the Merrick windows glowing warm as though nothing beneath had stirred. Yet Harper knew what he had seen could not be explained, not by science nor scripture. He returned to his lodging, his ledger open on the desk, but every time he tried to write, his hand faltered, as though the hum guided the pen to draw curves and symbols instead of letters. He stared at the ink stains, realizing they were not his own words, but something older that used his body as a conduit. The following day, the soil itself seemed to breathe beneath his feet, and whispers spread of a storm gathering on the horizon. Harper knew he could not remain a guest any longer. Whatever dwelled beneath the Merrick farm was stirring, and the family no longer tried to hide it. Their smiles were sharper, their children's eyes brighter, and when Harper refused a bowl of milk, Eleanor Merrick's hand lingered too long on his shoulder, her whisper brushing his ear, "Once you drink, doctor, you belong." That night, as clouds thickened and thunder groaned in the distance, the Merricks called their neighbors to the farm. Harper watched from the shadows as men and women who once cursed the family now accepted their bread with trembling gratitude. The storm lashed the valley, but inside the farmstead, warmth and abundance poured without end. Harper realized then that the night was not a feast, it was a ritual. The earth had been opened, and all who ate partook in its hunger. The ground softened, swallowing footprints whole, smoothing the soil as though erasing names from a ledger. Harper, trembling, knew he had crossed beyond observation into damnation, and so he resolved to test it, to prove it with experiment, even if it meant placing his own blood upon the altar of the well. It would be the experiment that stripped him of the last vestiges of denial. It would be the moment where science surrendered to something far older and far less merciful. The storm came sudden and violent, as though the valley itself had been waiting for a signal. The sky bruised purple, thunder rolled like drums beneath the hills, and the air was so heavy with electricity that Harper's hair stood on end. He pressed himself to the shadow of the barn, his journal clutched close, while the Merricks gathered their neighbors beneath the veil of rain. Families who had cursed the clan in whispers now trudged willingly across the sodden earth, carrying children in arms, clutching baskets to receive bread and jars of milk. Their faces were gaunt with hunger, their eyes hollow. Yet every step toward the Merrick house was taken without hesitation, as if drawn by a gravity beyond choice. Eleanor Merrick stood at the doorway with arms outstretched, her white dress clinging to her body in the downpour, her smile radiant and fixed. One by one, the neighbors were ushered inside where the table groaned with impossible abundance. Harper watched through the window as loaves were broken, bowls passed, and children fed. The storm's roar was muffled inside that house, replaced by hymns rising in strange cadences. Their voices blended with the thunder, twisting into something almost inhuman, a chant that held rhythm rather than melody. The floor seemed to vibrate in response, not only in the Merrick house, but through the very ground under Harper's boots. He tried to step closer, but found the soil softening beneath him. The earth, drenched in rain, did not behave as mud should. Each footprint he left filled itself in, smoothing over within seconds as if the land refused to record his passing. He tested it twice, 3 times, each mark erased as soon as he lifted his foot. It was not erosion nor water. It was deliberate, a wiping clean of memory. Harper's pulse quickened as he realized the ground itself was part of the ritual, swallowing evidence, refusing to bear witness. Inside, the voices rose louder. He caught fragments of words, not scripture, not English, but something older that clawed at the edges of understanding. Children's laughter punctuated the chant, shrill and wrong, as if they joined not in play, but in invocation. Harper pressed his ear against the barn wall, straining, until he heard a sound that made his stomach twist. The low sigh of soil opening, the same sigh he had heard beneath the smokehouse. It came from the fields beyond the house, where rows of corn shuddered violently, though no wind touched them. Compelled, Harper stumbled through the rain toward the fields. The stalks towered green, slick, their tassels heavy with wet. He pushed between them, his lantern guttering in the downpour until he reached a clearing at the center. The soil there was split wide, furrows opening and closing as if lungs inhaled beneath the earth. A warm vapor rose, sweet and metallic, curling around him like breath against his face. He fell to his knees, clutching his chest, for the rhythm beneath him matched the beat of his own heart, sinking until he feared his pulse no longer belonged to him. Through the haze he saw shapes, hands, perhaps, or roots slick with rain, pressing upward from the soil, only to sink back down as if testing the surface. The chant inside the house grew louder, and each note seemed to coax the earth wider, the sigh deepening into a growl. Harper staggered back, nearly dropping his lantern. He fled the clearing, stumbling through rows that now seemed endless, the corn closing behind him as if guiding his path back toward the Merrick house. By the time he broke free, drenched and shaking, the chant had ceased. The door swung shut, the storm's fury quieted, and the valley held its breath. He knew then that he could not rely on words alone. No one in Louisville, no one in the whole country, would believe the sounds he had heard or the soil that erased footprints. He needed proof beyond observation, proof no superstition could deny. And so, when the storm broke and the first streaks of dawn lit the wet fields, Harper resolved to conduct his experiment, not with rumor, not with testimony, but with blood and water, in the language science could not ignore. It would be the experiment that would strip away the last veil between reason and madness, and bind his fate to the hum that already followed him in every breath. At dawn, the valley lay hushed, as though the storm had scoured it clean, but Harper felt the silence throb like a wound beneath a bandage. He did not sleep, Instead, he gathered what instruments he could: vials, glass jars, a scalpel, a notebook whose pages were already stained with ink and rain. He needed proof. His mind clung to that word with a desperation that bordered on prayer. If the water could be measured, tested, confronted with the clarity of science, then the hum would lose its hold. That was his hope as he prepared his experiment. From a butcher in the neighboring village, he procured a calf, its throat opened cleanly, its blood still warm. He worked quickly, collecting it in bowls, steam curling against the morning chill. His hands shook, not from fatigue but from the certainty that the valley itself was watching. He carried the bowls into the barn where shadows clung, and laid out 3 jars. Into the first he poured well water, drawn in secret during the night while the Merrick slept. Into the second, water from a nearby creek. Into the third, distilled spirit he had brought from Louisville. Carefully, he dripped the calf's blood into each jar, recording every motion, as though the act of writing could shield him. The results came swiftly. The creek water thinned the blood, spreading it into a pale haze. The spirit curdled it into clots that sank like stone. But in the jar with well water, the blood did not separate, did not clot. It gathered itself into filaments, threads that twitched and coiled, forming a structure that writhed like muscle. Harper dropped the pipette, stumbling back, his pen falling useless to the ground. The filaments pressed against the glass, reaching outward, straining toward his hands with a deliberate will. For a moment, the jar seemed to breathe, condensation fogging its sides as though lungs labored within. Harper's rational mind screamed for explanation. Perhaps chemical reaction, perhaps unseen parasites, but the truth was undeniable. This was not decay, not corruption. This was growth. A living architecture forming from the marriage of blood and well water, as if the liquid itself carried memory and hunger. Harper forced himself forward, his breath shallow, and pressed his palm against the glass. At once the filaments surged, binding together into a single tendril that struck toward him with such force the jar rocked against the table. The glass grew warm beneath his skin, and in that instant he felt his pulse not as his own, but as something echoed within the jar. The rhythm aligned, perfect and terrible, until he yanked his hand away. He stumbled into the light, clutching his chest, the hum louder now than any heartbeat. The jars rattled behind him, their contents writhing like creatures impatient for release. Harper wanted to smash them, to burn them, but some darker instinct compelled him to preserve them as evidence. Proof. Yet as he covered the jars, he felt the gaze of the Merrick house heavy on him, as though the windows themselves had eyes. When Eleanor appeared in the yard, her white dress drying in the sun, she smiled at him with a knowing that froze the blood in his veins. She said nothing, only raised a hand in greeting, as if welcoming him into a covenant he had already joined. That night, Harper could not escape the vision of the tendril reaching for his hand. He dreamed of the soil opening wide, of roots slick with blood weaving through his veins, of his own body bending to the hum. He woke with the taste of iron sharp on his tongue, and his palm tender where it had pressed the glass. The skin was reddened, faintly veined with lines that seemed too deliberate to be natural. He bound his hand tightly, though he could not bind the dread that rose with every heartbeat. The Reverend Cole came to him at dawn, pale and hollow-eyed. He confessed that the storm had shaken the parish, that whispers spread of neighbors who had vanished after feasting with the Merricks, their names unspoken, their houses already collapsing into ruin as if they had never lived. Cole urged Harper to flee, to destroy his notes, to abandon proof for the sake of survival. But Harper's eyes burned with fevered conviction. "If we flee," he hissed, "then the truth rots here with them. I will not let science be silenced by superstition." Cole's silence was long, his gaze heavy. At last he whispered, "Then you must see the vault." The word hung in the air like a death knell. Harper knew of it from rumor, from the preacher's hesitant confessions, but now it was laid bare as the final step. The vault in the cemetery, sealed with iron, holding what the Merricks never allowed the earth to claim. And in his marrow, Harper knew that whatever stirred beneath the fields, whatever whispered through the water, whatever reached for him in the jar, it would be answered there. The cemetery lay on a low rise, its crooked stones silhouetted against a swollen moon. Grass grew high between the markers, swallowing the names of families long starved and gone. But at the far end stood the Merrick vault, a structure of blackened stone sunk deep into the earth. Its iron door was chained and bolted, the lock eaten with rust yet stubbornly intact, as though it had been set not to keep thieves out, but to keep something in. Harper and Reverend Cole approached in silence, their lanterns trembling in the night air, their breaths visible like smoke. The hum was already there, faint but insistent, carried not by the wind but by the ground beneath their boots. It grew louder with every step toward the vault, until their very ribs seemed to vibrate in sympathy. Cole hesitated, crossing himself, but Harper pressed forward. His hand burned where the tendrils had once touched, as though guiding him. He drew a crowbar from his satchel, its weight reassuring, the last tool of reason against the dark. With every strike the iron moaned, the sound echoing like voices trapped behind stone. At last the lock gave way, falling into the grass like a broken tooth. Cole whispered a prayer, but Harper only gripped the lantern tighter and pulled the door wide. The air that exhaled from the vault was thick and damp, warm as breath. It carried that same sweetness of rot and iron that haunted every corner of the Merrick farm. They descended into the dark, their lanterns casting long shadows along walls that glistened as if wet. Harper expected coffins, rows of the dead sealed against decay, but the vault held no bodies. Instead, the floor was packed with soil, heaped high in mounds, smooth as bread loaves, each one marked with grooves like finger trails pressed into clay. Some of the mounds pulsed faintly, as though something beneath shifted in restless sleep. At the far wall stood a stone altar, crude and damp, its surface slick with a sheen that caught the lantern light. Upon it lay fragments of cloth, locks of hair, brittle bones no longer whole. Carved above the altar were words in no tongue Harper knew, yet his mouth formed the syllables unbidden, a whisper that echoed back from the soil in voices not his own. Cole gripped his shoulder, hissing for silence, but the words had already been spoken. The hum surged, no longer beneath them but all around, swelling into a chant that pressed against their skulls until thought itself bent. The soil mounds stirred. One split open with a wet sigh, releasing a rush of vapor that smelled of honey and rust. From within, not a corpse but a shape emerged, neither root nor bone but something between, glistening with the same opalescence Harper had seen in the jars. It reached toward them, its surface folding like flesh, its movements deliberate as a hand. The preacher cried out, lifting his crucifix, but the hum only deepened, drowning his prayer. Harper, trembling, could not move. The grooves in the soil glowed faintly, forming patterns, letters perhaps, until one name stood clear before him. It was not Merrick. The name was older, heavier, carved not with ink or chisel, but with the memory of earth itself. And as the syllables formed in his mind, the vault seemed to lean inward, the soil breathing, the lantern flames bending as if drawn toward that sound. Cole fell to his knees, his prayers breaking into sobs. But Harper's lips moved of their own accord, shaping the forbidden name, answering the call that had been building since the first sip of water, the first bite of bread. The vault walls trembled, soil split wider, releasing more vapor, more shapes rising like seedlings forced too quickly from the ground. The hum became a chorus, no longer beneath their feet but within their veins. Harper's journal slipped from his grasp, pages fluttering into the damp earth, where they dissolved like leaves. He tried to scream, but the sound that left his mouth was not his own. It was the chant, the same rhythm he had heard in dreams, the same cadence that had guided his hand to write symbols older than scripture. Cole fled, stumbling up the stair into the night, his cries lost to the wind. But Harper remained, bound by the soil's breath, by the tendril that had touched his hand, by the truth that had unmade him. The shapes pressed closer, whispering the name again and again until it filled every hollow of his mind. The vault door slammed shut above him, the iron groaning as if sealed by hands unseen. And in the valley, they say, the Merrick's fields never failed. Their children never starved, their table never emptied. But neighbors whispered of a new figure who walked the farm at dusk, a man with eyes too bright, who never left a footprint no matter how soft the soil. Some claimed it was Harper, others said it was only the ground wearing his likeness, answering to the name he had spoken in the vault. Whatever truth lay beneath, no one dared to ask. The hum still carried through the night air, steady as a heartbeat, waiting for anyone willing to listen.